Hello and welcome to the Massar Podcast, where we explore business and human rights in the MENA region. Together, we demystify the path towards a more rights-respecting and sustainable future for businesses in the Arab world, one conversation at a time. Have you questioned what does responsible business across the MENA region really look like? How can companies meet global expectations while navigating local realities? How can companies identify and manage human rights impacts and risks? Massar means path in Arabic, and that's exactly what we're here to explore. The path businesses in the Middle East are taking towards responsibility and sustainability. I'm your host, Krystel Bassil, founder of BHR MENA. This podcast was brought to you in collaboration with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Rule of Law MENA program. This is our very first episode, and we couldn't be more excited to start this journey, because lasting change in the Arab world must come from within. Too often, international conversations portray business in the region as a single story, but it isn't. We cannot all put businesses in one bucket. The state of play isn't the same across the region. Not all sectors or countries are moving at the same pace, nor have all businesses grasped that corporations, not just governments, have responsibility to respect human rights. While some are already leading the way into innovating in sustainability, labor standards, and social investment, others are still navigating complex governance systems, resource constraints, informal economies, and at times, conflict. Understanding this diversity is key to designing approaches to business and human rights that are realistic, locally grounded, and regionally owned. Across the region, governments are setting bold 2030, 2040 visions, investing in diversification, green growth, and social reform. For the first time in decades, the world is starting to see that there is much more to the MENA region than conflict. There's vision, there's execution, and there's talent. And there's ambition at a scale and speed that are redefining what is possible. But for change to be meaningful, it has to be homegrown. Human rights in our region are evolving, not through existing blueprints, but through dialogue, adaptation, and respect for our culture, religious, and economic realities. That's why we keep referring to the international frameworks like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights or the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises for Responsible Business Conduct. Not because they're global rules that we have to follow, but because they represent tested practice on how business can respect people and the planet in a practical and measurable way. Our task isn't to reinvent the wheel, but to adapt it to our local context. And that's exactly what Massar is about, creating a space to explore how businesses in our region can build a more rights-respecting, sustainable, and inclusive future, one conversation at a time. Today I am joined by Noor Hamadeh. Noor is a senior advocacy counsel at the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, ICAR, where she advances legal safeguards against corporate abuse in U.S. supply chains and advocates for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And she's a leading MENA voice on business and human rights. Hi, Noor. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, Krystel. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Noor, let's begin with the basics. Very simply, can you please tell us what is business and human rights?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. So, business and human rights is really an area of law that arose from the question of, as businesses become larger and more global, and their impact becomes larger and more global, do they too, like countries, have responsibilities when it comes to human rights? And if they do, what role do they play? So businesses are central to communities, to social and economic development. But like I said, this question of business and human rights also explores their responsibilities to these communities that they're a part of and aims to address business-related human rights abuses that might come up And that includes withholding of wages or paying low wages, requiring employees to work in difficult or hazardous conditions. A company might pollute the water of a community that the community depends on or discriminate. Or there are also situations where companies operate on land that belongs to indigenous communities, for example. So this idea that businesses have responsibilities towards human rights, towards the human rights of the communities they impact, resulted in the development of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011. And the UN's guiding principles really have three pillars. The first is for governments have a duty to protect people from corporate abuse through laws and regulations. The second is respect. So the idea that businesses themselves have a responsibility to make sure that they don't cause harm even beyond what the law says. And the third pillar is remedy. And it's the idea that both governments and companies have to ensure that if people's rights are violated, that there are ways to put things right through justice, through compensation, or addressing the root cause of the harm that was caused in the first place.
And so very clear, but we see from our experience that many businesses operating in different jurisdictions their first reaction to things is to say, yes, we're very much applying local laws, we're respectful of existing legislation. So I get a first sense that what you're trying to tell us is that business and human rights often means working not only with the law, but what the law could or should be, how business practices need to go beyond sort of the legal minimum requirements, and how stakeholders like workers, communities, and civil society can influence sort of the how business operations operating on the ground. I know we will speak more about the international sort of movement of all of these ideas, but before we go further, we also notice practice that there's some confusion sometimes around the idea of business and human rights, CSR, sustainability, ESG, many buzzwords we hear. And I think it's very important for us to sort of clarify what each of these concepts are. So can you tell us what is the difference?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. These buzzwords often come up and are confused with each other. So maybe I'll just go through and kind of define a few key terms. So the first, I kind of already talked about business and human rights, but business and human rights is really about a corporation's responsibility. So it starts from the idea that every company must respect human rights in all of their operations and throughout their supply chains, and really consider the impacts that they have on individuals and communities that come into contact with their operations. The second term I'll define is corporate social responsibility. And I think these are often seen as the same thing or very similar, but corporate social responsibility, or CSR, is more about a company's voluntary good deeds, or philanthropy, for example. So it's when a company donates to charities, sponsors community events, or, for example, runs employee volunteer programs. So these are positive contributions, but they're optional contributions, and they don't necessarily address a company's core impacts. They instead kind of contribute positively to a community without addressing maybe the ways that they're contributing negatively as well. So the company can run a great CSR program and still have serious human rights problems throughout their supply chain. Another term I'll pull is sustainability. So sustainability is really a much broader sort of big picture goal. And the idea behind sustainability is meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. So it includes taking care of the environment that we live in, social well-being of employees and communities around you or around the company, and economic viability. Does this company make sense economically, environmentally, socially? And I think maybe the ultimate question that sustainability asks is, are we running our government are we running our business in a way that can last socially, environmentally, and economically in the long term? So that's kind of the concept of sustainability. And maybe the last term I'll define is ESG, or environmental, environmental social governance. So that's what ESG stands for. And it's really a measurement and investment framework. It's a framework that investors use to evaluate companies' operations, and they use these criteria to evaluate performance on environmental issues like carbon emissions, for example, social issues like labor rights, diversity, and governance issues. So looking at accountability of the board, or potentially the presence of corruption in a company's operations. So that's the idea behind ESG. And so it's less about obligation in the way that human rights responsibilities are, and more about data and risk management, and really assessing a company's financial value based on metrics.
Thank you, Noor. So, but it doesn't mean that these concepts, even though very different, do not intersect on the idea of being people-centered or environmentally centered in some instances. So to sort of sum up, BHR is the mandatory respect for human rights. The CSR is the voluntary good deed, philanthropy side of doing things. And sustainability is the long-term impact, as you were mentioning. And ESG is really how to measure all of that. So they do create sort of this ecosystem of how we deal, how we identify, or also mitigate or strategize around, I guess, being a people-centered and environmentally centered business. But if we go back to UN guiding principles, many businesses are like, okay, great. So what is expected? You tell us about this framework. What is really expected of businesses in order to adequately identify and mitigate the human rights risks we've been mentioning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, I think just going back to the guiding principles, like you said, the reason I'm referencing them is because they've really become just that, sort of guiding principles for how businesses should operate, how they should respect human rights. And they're really seen that way internationally. And I think one thing you mentioned, that sort of human rights responsibilities are mandatory. And if we look at kind of the hard law that exists, the UN guiding principles aren't strictly mandatory in the sense that there are legal consequences for violating them, but that is starting to change. And so maybe I'll go back to the question you asked, which is what are companies supposed to do? And the answer to that is within the guiding principles. And the guiding principles require companies to engage in a process called human rights due diligence. And this is something that, beyond the guiding principles, has also been required through other frameworks and expanded upon in other frameworks, like the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. The International Labor Organization also has a declaration of principles that mentions human rights due diligence. And so human rights due diligence, I think, is not a new concept. I think maybe the concept of due diligence in general is not a new concept. This is something that companies are already familiar with. It's a process they engage in when they're entering a merger or beginning operations in a new country, for example. So human rights due diligence essentially says that, basically just asks companies to incorporate human rights considerations into these processes and engage in due diligence process that really centers human rights specifically. So it's essentially a process that requires companies to, or it's a process through which companies identify and assess actual and potential adverse impacts on human rights throughout their supply chains. And so maybe what I can do is walk you through essentially what a proactive, responsible, transparent human rights due diligence process looks like through the framework of the UN guiding principles. So if we break it down step by step, the first step is assessing risks. So a company needs to ask, where could people be harmed by what we do? And this could be within the workplace, throughout their supply chains, or the community around them. And so what this requires companies to do is to look at the most salient risks. And what that means is the risks that are most serious or the most likely to occur, because there could be a countless number of potential abuses or risks that exist in a supply chain. And so it's just unrealistic, frankly, for companies to be expected to address all of them at once. But if they're looking at what is the most serious and what's the most likely and prioritizing those, that is a more realistic goal. And so then that takes us to the second step, which is preventing or reducing harm. So once companies identify these salient risks, they need to try to stop them from happening. So looking at what changes do we need to make within our supply chain or within our operations in order to mitigate or prevent these risks. So that might include having conversations with suppliers, for example, or with the communities who are impacted to understand those abuses a little bit better or those risks a little bit better. And it might include kind of developing new rules within the corporate structure, but taking steps to identify how to change the situation to mitigate or prevent those risks from occurring. And then the third step would be to monitor and track. So basically, once these changes have been made, continue tracking the situation, assess how things have changed as a result of those changes, and make additional changes as needed, basically. And then the next step, step number 4, would be to communicate. So once companies have made these changes, as they're monitoring and tracking, they need to communicate honestly and transparently with investors, with stakeholders about what challenges exist, what steps they've taken, what still needs to be done, maybe what risks might still exist that they need to work on, but being very open and transparent with multiple different stakeholders that are involved in their work. And then the last step is to provide a remedy. So if it's not just a risk, if actual harm does occur, the company needs to help make it right. So this might include compensating affected workers, correcting harmful practices, so changing the rules to prevent it from happening again, or improving systems again so that it doesn't happen again. But I think the key here is that this isn't just a thing that a company does. It's an ongoing process that needs to be ever present in their operations to make sure that as situations change, as things develop, they're always keeping an eye on how can we make sure that our operations are human rights conscious. So as I mentioned, these practices aren't new. Many companies already conduct human rights due diligence, and all companies, I think, already know how to do due diligence generally. Maybe not necessarily from a human rights centered lens, but due diligence is a common corporate process. And there are countless guidances on how to do this, including sector specific, country specific, etc. So yeah, just to say this is not a new process, and it's something that is already starting to be mandated into law. I mentioned that the UN Guiding Principles are sort of not legally binding. That is starting to change, and that's starting to change specifically when it comes to human rights due diligence as required in the UN Guiding Principles. So there are already human rights due diligence laws in France and Germany requiring companies to conduct human rights due diligence. And the EU just last year passed the Corporate Sustainability and Due Diligence Directive, which would essentially require all EU companies and companies that operate to a certain extent within the EU to conduct human rights due diligence. And there are countless human rights due diligence law proposals in other countries like Thailand, South Korea, Japan, Brazil, Peru, and that's just a few of the countries where these laws are starting to be discussed and potentially put on the books. So in a few years, this is really going to be a global standard and something that companies really should be watching for. So sorry, I know I talked a lot on that one, but I think it's a really
No worries.
important issue. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, thank you for expanding on all of that. I guess to go back, I think you raised a very important point to say that companies are responsible first and foremost to dealing with their salient human rights risk, because um, as you explain how human rights due diligence is sort of the process is put in place. This is sort of the initial approach a company would have in embedding these processes. But then once they've identified these risks, it could be confusing to say, okay, how can I deal with all of these existing or potential risks? And you rightfully pointed out that the company needs to address the most salient risks. And it's important, I guess, what I would add is to say that some of these risks are also systemic human rights risks. So they may be rooted in structural or embedded in how a certain economy or a certain industry is operating. So it's not an isolated incident that's directly related to the said company. So, for example, if we can give examples, so we have the issue of migrant workers and their dependency on recruitment fees, but this is a systemic problem we see across not just across the Gulf, but across the Arab region as a whole, but also worldwide, where there is migrant workers or domestic workers that are vulnerable to this sort of recruitment process. Wage suppression and informality. This we see it in the agricultural system worldwide, really. I mean, let alone in the Arab states, but this is, I mean, we see these kind of practices happen in agriculture, in the garment and manufacturing, really globally. We also have gender-based discrimination, climate-related vulnerabilities as well, which don't like pertain to a certain sector, but really are happening across different places and geographies.
So maybe I can give an example of sort of positive business practices in the region. So I was just talking about sort of this idea that there are structural barriers in place that disincentivize human rights conscious business practices. But I'll give a couple of examples from the region where human rights conscious business practices are actually incentivized, that like switches this incentive structure to be more positive. So one example is international financial institutions and the role they play in providing access to finance for businesses in the region. So international financial institutions, or IFIs, have been powerful drivers of change in the MENA region, and really through embedding environmental and social standards into financing of businesses and effectively tying access to capital with better business practices. So rather than offering loans unconditionally, institutions like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development or the International Finance Corporation require companies that they engage with or that they finance to demonstrate compliance with labor, environmental, and governance benchmarks, often backed by technical assistance to help them meet those requirements. So one example I'll give from Jordan, the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, collaborated with the International Labor Organization. And maybe I'll turn to some negative examples as well.
Which is good, but we also have many challenging examples of negative, I guess, situations where businesses have caused harm or violations of human rights in their operations. And yeah, that'd be great to also pick up on a few, I guess, bad examples just to sort of contrast the discussion.
And I'll take maybe the World Cup as an example of sort of a mega event that really put human rights related violations at sort of in the spotlight in the region. And so I'll maybe talk about the World Cup in Qatar. And what we saw was countless news reports of hundreds of migrant workers being brought in under the kafala system, who were subjected to widespread and systematic abuses from wage theft to unsanitary and crowded living conditions, hazardous working conditions, and civil society organizations, both local and internationally, really mobilized to spotlight abuses and campaign for change. And that activism played a huge role in really just highlighting the negative harm that these types of events can have. But also in Qatar dismantling parts of the kafala system and starting to have that conversation. But for many of these workers, those changes came after years of exploitative working conditions, extremely low pay, squalid living conditions. And so there have also been reports that some of these reforms are not actually being implemented. So even with the reforms that we're seeing, it's been too little, too late, and ultimately there's not a real there's not a real effort to kind of really make these changes. And I think maybe one thing I'll say now that we're seeing is with the Saudi Arabia World Cup that's coming up in 2034, is I think it's interesting that there's sort of two large events coming up in the region, sort of in very close succession. And what's interesting is that Saudi Arabia now has the benefit of seeing what happened in Qatar. And I think ultimately, it's really going to take a global effort by civil society organizations, by governments, by businesses that are participating to pressure Saudi to make these meaningful changes. We're already seeing civil society groups sort of raising alarm bells and questions about labor standards, and really about how these mega events impact workers and communities, especially in a location in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf where there's already so much concern about these types of abuses. And so Saudi Arabia has claimed to take some steps to reform its labor laws and align more closely with international standards. But again, we're unfortunately seeing little implementation of these changes.
So I guess this comes to a very good way to concluding our discussion in the way we sort of started it, to say that real impact and doing no harm is not just about adopting global frameworks by name, but really about localizing them and implementing them in practice, whether it's by governments or businesses. And for the MENA region, that means translating these principles into action that reflects the legal system, the cultural values, the economic realities, and ensuring that these business do respect human rights in order to align with these frameworks we've been mentioning. I want to thank you, Noor, for your insightful conversation and for better framing what business and human rights is to our audience. I want to thank everyone for listening to the first episode of Massar Podcast. And it's a conversation that hopefully inspires hope and action for businesses, or at least triggers curiosity around the topic. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. We will be delving in the future episodes in more detail on these topics. And stay tuned for our next episode. And until then, take care and bye-bye.